Alright, I guess we can get started then. It's 6:03. So hello everyone. Welcome back to Beginner Chess. Or if you're new here, welcome to Beginner Chess. My name is Niranjan. I'm the Wellbeing Inclusions Officer for Chess Society. I run these beginner lessons every week. I do intermediate workshops as well every other Friday. And you might have seen me around during the Thursday sessions as well. So nice to meet you guys. I've seen some new faces today as well, so nice to meet you guys. So today we're going to look at endgames. Pretty much, I've already covered 2 lessons on endgames in the last semester, so I'm basically going to be recapping over the stuff that I covered in those sessions, but then add a bit more new stuff as well. So hopefully there's some stuff for everybody, pretty much. And essentially, I've got some learning objectives for today. We're basically going to look at we're going to split the session into 3 sections. So we're going to look at how we can do some more advanced checkmating patterns. I say advanced, I'm sure you guys are able to do it as well. So we're going to look at how to checkmate with a king and queen. We're going to look at how to checkmate with 2 rooks. And we're going to look at how to checkmate with just a king and a rook. And then later on, we're going to look at how you can convert a winning endgame. And I'll explain what that means afterwards. And then in the 3rd section, I'll just let you guys play. I've got some examples of stuff you guys can do, so that's what we can do in the last 20 minutes, hopefully. But let's get started. So for those of you who don't know what an endgame is, what is the endgame, right? The endgame is pretty much, so a chess game in of itself is split into 3 sections pretty much. So you got the opening, you got the middle game, and you got the end game. And the end game, it's in the name, right? It's the end of the game pretty much. So when all the pieces or most of the pieces have been traded off, that's the end game pretty much. So a chess position towards the end of the game where either the queens have been traded off, or if there's not that many pieces left on the board, it counts as an end game pretty much. And these are 2 examples of endgames right here. So as you can see in this example, there's 2 pawns on each side, and there's just the kings left. So that's an example of an endgame. And this is also an example of an endgame because the queens have been traded off. So there's no queen here, and there's no queen here. So it's an endgame. I don't really like the concept of just after the queens have been traded, it's called an endgame. I don't think that's correct, but that's, according to chess law, apparently, that's an endgame, pretty much. I would say this counts towards more like a middle game, but you can argue with me if you want. It's it's the law, I suppose. And I mentioned before, a chess game is split into 3 sections, so the opening, the middle game, end game. Why are we learning the end game first? Why are we starting right at the end? And it's because when teaching beginners, there's not that many pieces left on the board itself. So end games they're theoretical, which means that they're solved, and pretty much because there's not that many pieces left on the board, some guy in the 1700s, the 1800s has already looked at the exact same position that you've seen on the board as well, and they've said this is how you do it, right? Because there's not that many pieces left on the board, so it's quite easy to do that. Whereas compared to middle games and openings, for example, there's 64 squares on the board. There's 8 pieces each. You have 8 pieces each. The combinations of however many chess positions there are in the opening and middle game, is so much. And different periods of time, so the 1800s, 1900s, everybody plays the opening and middle game differently. So there's different strategies that you can do in the opening and the middle game. But for end games, they're solved, right? Because there's not that many pieces left on the board. So that's why we're starting it, because it's theoretical. So if you learn the techniques, then you've learned how to do the end game pretty much. And a fun fact is that the Russian School of Chess, so the chess federation in Russia, they have a school, and they believe that the endgame was the most important part of chess. And so when they had students in the Russian School of Chess, they would only teach the endgame to them. The very first thing that they teach them was the endgame, nothing else. They wouldn't learn openings, they wouldn't learn middle games, no tactics, no strategies, nothing like that. They'll just give them endgames and be like, solve it. That's it. And then once they'd got to a sufficient amount of level, then they'll learn everything else afterwards. So I guess we're doing a Russian school kind of kind of technique where we're learning the endgame first. And essentially the end goal of the endgame is to checkmate your opponent. And essentially a checkmate is pretty much a situation on the chessboard where you're attacking the enemy king and you've attacked it so much that anywhere the king can go, well, it can't go anywhere pretty much. Any move that it makes is illegal, right? So when the king is unable to get out of check, so out of an attack, it's called a checkmate and the game is over. So it can't be checkmate without it being check. And some etymology of the word checkmate if you're interested. Can you open the door, Charlie? Thank you. And I've got some examples of checkmate. So you've got these three examples. You've got the scholar's checkmate, back rank checkmate, for example, and ladder checkmate. So in this position, you can see that this queen is attacking this king right now. And this king can't move anywhere, right? Because it can't take this queen, because hypothetically, if it did take it, it would be captured by the bishop. So this is a checkmate. And it can't move here as well because this queen defends that square. So it's checkmate. I'm not sure why these two are very blurry, but hey ho, it's okay. This is a back rank checkmate because the king is under attack by this rook over here, and it can't move anywhere, and it's under attack by this rook. And this is a ladder checkmate, and essentially this queen attacks the king, and this rook defends all of these escape squares pretty much. And we'll look at a ladder checkmate later on, because we're looking at how to checkmate with two rooks, and you got to know how to do a ladder checkmate with that. I'll explain it in more detail as we go along, but it's okay if you don't understand it so far. I'll go into it in a bit more detail afterwards. And so not every position that you get is going to look exactly like this. Hello. You're not going to get a position that looks exactly like this. You've got to do the work yourself. You've got to coordinate your pieces together so that you reach checkmate pretty much. And that's what I'm going to tell you guys about today. So I've got 3 examples of ways you can checkmate pretty much. So I mentioned in the learning objectives that we're going to look at how to checkmate with 2 rooks, with a king and a rook, a king and a rook in itself, and a king and a queen. So first of all, I'm going to start with checkmating with 2 rooks, right? So if you guys remember, the rook, it moves up, down, left, and right. It doesn't move diagonally, and it can't move through other pieces as well. And checkmating with 2 rooks, as I mentioned before, you got to use the ladder technique, which I covered in the first Endgames lesson that I taught. So if you missed that, it's on YouTube, so you can go and watch it on there as well. But essentially, the two rooks that we have, they sort of work together to cut off the enemy king and attack it at the same time as well. So you can see it in this position over here. We have 2 rooks, and this is a checkmate right now, because this rook right here, it's attacking the king, but this rook over here, it cuts off all of these squares for this king to move. So this is checkmate because this king can't move anywhere. And I've got examples of how we can do this pretty much. So let's see how we do it. I've got an example position over here, and hello. And essentially, we've got 2 rooks on the boards. They're sort of scattered at the moment, and the king is right in the center. So we got to figure out a way to coordinate all of these pieces together, so both of our rooks, and deliver a checkmate pretty much. And the way we do this is that we've got to find a way to cut off the enemy's king circulation and force it to one side of the board. So essentially, there's 4 things you got to do. So you got to use one of your rooks to block the king's escape squares. You got to keep the other rook safe and ready to deliver an attack later on, and then you sort of alternate between that. So one rook attacks and one rook traps the enemy king, and you alternate that until you get to the edge of the board, and then you can bring your king in as well. If it helps, you can use your king, but just for the sake of the demonstration today, we're just going to look at how to do it with 2 rooks.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When you say bring in your king, you mean swap out a rook for a king? What do you mean by that?
So in every position, you're going to have your own king as well, right? So if you bring your king towards the opponent's king as well, then you sort of can use the king to block off enemy squares as well. And I'll show you how it's done,
Okay.
if that's okay.
Thank you.
So we're in the same position before, right? And essentially what I said before is that we want to cut off some squares for the enemy king, pretty much. So right now, the squares that this king looks at are all of these squares, right? You want to cut off as many squares as possible. So something like rook g5 over here. Now this rook, it cuts off all of these squares, right? It can't move to here, here, or here anymore. So it can only move to these highlighted squares. So we've cut off some squares for the enemy king. And let's say the king moves to e4, for example. So out of any of these squares, it moves to this square, for example. Then we move the rook to b3. So we're cutting off even more squares, right? So before, it could go to all of these squares here, but now we've cut off all of these squares. And now it can only move to these two squares. Does that make sense so far? Yeah? And now we've reached what's called like a sandwich, pretty much. We've sandwiched the king in between our rooks so that it can only move to these two squares in between the rooks. So let's say if it moves back to d4 again, for example, now we start the ladder checkmate. So essentially, now what we do is we force the enemy king to one side of the board. So I'm going to choose this side of the board. So right at the top, I'm going to choose this side. And essentially what you want to do is you want to deliver an attack on the king. So rook to g4, for example. Now instead of the squares that it can go to are here, it can now only go to these three squares. So we're pushing the king up towards the end of the board, right? Does that make sense? Yeah? So as I mentioned before, one rook attacks and the other rook cuts off the enemy king, pretty much. So this rook makes sure that it can't go down anymore. It only has to go up. So the king moves up, for example, and now this rook over here cuts off these squares, right? Right now, this king can only go to these 5 squares, okay? And remember, we want to push the king upwards, right? We want to push the king up. So we want to cut off these 2 squares. How do we do it? What's the next move?
G4 to G5.
G4 to G5?
Is it B3 to B4?
It's B3 to B4 to B5 actually.
Why are we putting it upwards?
It can go anywhere. So like you could push it to this side of the board, you could push it to this side of the board, you could push it to any side of the board pretty much.
You have to push it to 5.
Yeah. But I've chosen this side of the board just for demonstration purposes pretty much. So because I'm pushing it upwards, I want to make sure that the only squares that this king can go to is here. So I'm going to push this to b5 so that the only squares it can go to right now are these 3. Does that make sense so far? Like we're pushing the king upwards so that we can checkmate at the end of the board pretty much. So this rook attacks now, and this rook covers off the squares below the king. So remember before, this rook was doing the attacking before, and this one was doing the covering of the squares, but now it alternates, right? We alternate between attacking and covering off squares. So if the king moves up, we do an attack again, we bring the king all the way up one more time, up here, the king moves again, we push it up even more until we reach the end. So it reached the top of the board now, and we deliver the final move of checkmate. Does that make sense so far? Yeah? So there's some alternatives to this as well. So you're not always going to get this position. I've just shown it as a demonstration pretty much. So if we get to something like this, the king can also move here, for example. And remember, we wanted to push the king up, and last time we played this move over here. Why is that a bad move?
The king can just capture your rook.
Yeah, exactly. So the king, let's say hypothetically we play this, the king can just capture the rook, right? So what we want to do is we want to swing over. So we want to make sure that we move the rook back here, for example, and then let's say if the king moves, then we do it again, right? So not just we don't just do it on one side of the board. We have to swing the rook the other way to make sure that it's not being attacked by the enemy king. And we carry on doing the same ladder technique. And then it's the exact same in this position as well. We can't go here, for example, because the king would just take. So we swing the rook over again, and now this enemy king can only go to these two squares. Let's say if it goes here, for example, that's checkmate. Does that make sense so far? Like one rook does the attacking, the other rook covers the enemy squares. And then if there's a position where the enemy king attacks your rook, you swing it over so that the king can't attack it anymore. I'll give you guys time like later on in the session where you can sort of like experiment with it yourself and try to make sure that you can do it as well. But so far, that's the first thing that I wanted to cover, pretty much. The other two that I wanted to cover was checkmating with one queen. So this is a little bit more difficult, but it's with the right technique, you're able to do it, and it becomes second nature to you guys. So pretty much in the last one, so I talked about two rooks. You could use the two rooks itself, like you didn't have to use your king for this, but we only have one queen in this example, right? So you gotta use your king as well in this position. So essentially, when you're checkmating with one queen, you want to make sure that your king and your queen, they work together to deliver the checkmate. And essentially, the queen does all the attacking, but the king is the one that it supports the queen pretty much, and it defends the enemy. It defends like all the squares for the enemy king to move to. That explanation was a bit off, but like I'll get onto like a proper demonstration of how we do it pretty much. So I've got this example over here, and essentially what you want to do is it's something that chess players called knight opposition. That sounds like really complicated, but trust me, like it will make sense to you after I explain it pretty much. Essentially, we've got four things that we want to do as well. We want to use the queen to take away the king space pretty much. And we want to do this by keeping the queen at a knight's distance away from the king. What I mean by that is that, so the knight moves in an L shape, so it moves two squares up and one square to any direction pretty much, or two squares down, something like that, exactly. And you want to keep a knight's distance, and what that means is like, you want to make sure that if you want to keep you want to play something like queen e3 for example, because if you place the queen over here, it's looking at the king as if it was a knight. It sounds really complicated, but like I'll show you on the proper board pretty much. And essentially, like you keep staring at the enemy king as long as like you have to get it to the edge of the board, just like with two rooks. And essentially, like once you have the knight opposition, you bring your king closer and you sort of force it to the edge of the board, and then later on, once it's reached the end of the board, you checkmate with the queen, and it's protected by your own king. And I'll show you the example of it pretty much. So we have the exact same position as I mentioned before. We want to play this move, so queen e3, and this is what we call knight opposition, because we're looking at the king as if our queen was a knight. So we're keeping a knight's distance away from this king. Let's say if the king moves, for example, we continue knight opposition. We continue looking at the king as if we were a knight. So knight opposition again. Let's say if the king moves. So this is still knight opposition. So now we bring the king forwards. Okay? Let's say if it continues knight opposition again, we carry on with the king. We bring our king closer, and we bring it closer again, and we bring it closer again, until there's no more knight opposition. So now the king steps back, the enemy king steps back, we bring king opposition again, knight opposition, sorry. we carry on like this until we keep bringing our king closer. We bring the king closer, and now we don't have the knight opposition anymore. So we bring the knight opposition back. And now we bring our king, because on this move it's still knight opposition. So we bring the king, and notice how we don't go here, for example, because this king now has nowhere else to move anymore, and there's no other pieces that can move. So this is called stalemate, exactly. It's called stalemate. So every time that you make a move in chess, you always want to make sure that it's not stalemate. So what that means is you want to make sure that the enemy king always has somewhere to move, pretty much. So playing something like this means that the king can't move anywhere. It can't go here, and it can't go here anymore, because it's illegal, pretty much, because this queen covers all of these squares. So this is a bad move, right? Bringing the queen there is a bad move. So what you want to do is you want to step back a little bit, right? You want to make sure that the enemy king still has some squares, and then bring your king even closer. So right now this king over here can only move to this square right now. So it does. We bring our king even more closer to the edge of the board, and notice how this king can still move right now. So it can still move back to the edge of the board, and now we deliver checkmate. So that was a bit more complicated, but as I mentioned before, like, I'll give you guys some time at the end of the session to sort of experiment with it, to try it out for yourself. But the main thing to remember is that knight opposition. So you want to make sure that you use your queen as if it was a knight, pretty much. You want to stare at the enemy king and keep that knight opposition, pretty much. And then if you don't have knight opposition anymore, so if it's still knight opposition, you bring your king closer. You bring it closer, you bring it closer, and you essentially force it to the edge of the board. Keep bringing it to the edge of the board. Keep bringing it. Make sure that it's not stalemate. And checkmate. Does that make sense, by the way? Yeah? I appreciate that was more difficult because, like, I've already covered the basic checkmating principles in, like, my previous lectures, so we're doing a bit more complicated stuff. But hopefully that made sense for you guys. Yeah? It made sense? Yeah? So now we move on to the final one, where we're checkmating with one rook. And this is where it gets even more difficult. So if you think that the last one was more difficult, this is even more difficult. I actually learned this quite recently. So I'm third year right now, but I only learned this in my first year of university, and someone else had to explain it to me. So you still learn something new every day, I suppose. And I did not update this. Whoops. But essentially, checkmating with one rook is probably the most difficult checkmating technique that you can do. The most difficult is doing it with a knight and bishop. I actually have no idea how to do that. I've been tried, like, someone tried to teach me how to do it, and I still have no clue. Right? It's very difficult. But checkmating with one rook itself is a bit more difficult as well. This is the wrong picture, by the way. There's supposed to be just one, and there's supposed to be a king there. I forgot to update it, but it's okay. Essentially, it's kind of similar to how you do it with the queen, but it's a slightly different technique, pretty much. Essentially, like, the similarities of it is that you use the rook and the king at the same time, pretty much. They work together. So let's say we have an example like this. We have our king and rook in the corner, and we have this enemy king in the center. Essentially, what we want to do is we want to cut off all the king space, so the enemy king space. And essentially we do this by, we have to sort of, like, create a box around the enemy king so that, like, we suffocate it towards one side of the board, pretty much. And I'll show you the example of it, like, later on. And essentially we use the rook to make that box, and we keep our own rook protected by our own king, pretty much. And essentially we make that box smaller, and this pushes the king towards the edge of the board, pretty much. And then once the enemy king has reached the end of the board, pretty much, then we deliver checkmate. And again, like, I'll show you how this is done. So let's say we have this position again. Essentially what we want to do is we want to create a box around this king. So we bring our king, first of all. We want to make sure that both of these kings, they're sort of staring at each other pretty much. We want to make sure that they're staring at each other. They want to get as close as possible. So we bring our king all the way towards the enemy king, and we play something like rook e1, for example. This move cuts off all of this square, all of these squares for the king to move, and so we're creating this box, right? A box of every move that the enemy king can move to, pretty much. And essentially we want to make that box as small as possible, and we want to make sure that we get this enemy king towards the edge of the board. So notice how the enemy king moves forward. We cut off these squares for the king. So essentially we've made this box even smaller. Do you guys see what I mean by the box, pretty much? So we're cutting off all of these squares, and now the king only can move within this box. And essentially we're doing it by these two pieces, right? So let's say if the king moved here, for example, we can't shrink the box anymore, so we bring the king forward, pretty much. We just make a weighted move, pretty much, and then let the opponent's king, let them move it back inside the box. So let's say if they go here, we make the box smaller. So we've cut off all of these squares now. So previously it can move to all of these squares, but we're making that box even smaller. And we make it even smaller by bringing our king and making the box smaller. You see, we're making the box even smaller. We're forcing it between these squares. We're forcing it to make sure that it gets to the edge of the board. And we make it smaller. We bring our king, and we make it smaller. We make it even smaller. And now notice it can only move to these two squares. And in this position, we can deliver checkmate like this. So we made the box smaller and smaller and smaller until the enemy king reached the end of the board, and we deliver checkmate from there. Does that make sense? Obviously, like, you guys are not going to have this exact position. You're going to have like a lot more complicated positions, I suppose, like different variations of this. But the principle still remains the same. Like, you're still going to have to try and make that box, but it will look a little bit different when you guys do it. And like, you're going to like figure it out at the end of the session. Like, we're gonna go over it again, so like you guys are gonna do it by yourselves, and it's gonna look different, but I'll try and help you out if you've got any questions afterwards. But did that make sense so far? Did that make sense? Yeah? And for part 2, I just wanted to talk a little bit about converting winning endgames. So essentially, you're not gonna have positions that look like this, for example. You've still got to get to a position like this. So you might have a winning endgame. So you might be up a queen, for example, and your opponent still has pieces on the board. I still need to edit this. I forgot to edit it. I'm not sure why. But essentially, having a load of pieces on the board is quite difficult to get a position where you can checkmate. So the easiest way to deliver checkmate on your opponent as a beginner is to get rid of all the pieces on the board, right? Get rid of everything on the board. Make sure that only you have the pieces, and deliver the checkmate the way that like everybody else does. So using the techniques. And as I mentioned before, like having enemy pieces on the board, you might slip up and you might like blunder a piece, for example, and that's just going to make everything difficult, right? So you want to make sure that you get rid of all the pieces as effectively as possible, get rid of all the enemy pieces, and then you might have your own pawns as well, so that you can promote those pawns later on, and it becomes easier to checkmate at the end. So as I mentioned, take all the pieces, promote 2 queens, and go for checkmate. And I've got some examples. I've got 2 examples over here. We have this winning endgame, for example. We have 3 pawns over here. Black has 4 pawns, and black has a rook. This is a completely winning endgame for white because this queen is worth a lot more than this rook. Because remember, the queens can move up, down, left, right, and diagonally as well. So it's more powerful than this enemy rook, and it can't move diagonally. So as I mentioned, like you got to make sure that you try and take all of all of black's pieces, and then push all of these pawns to become queens, and then deliver checkmate on the board. So your queen is the most powerful piece, so you've got to use it. So in this position, maybe I would try and go for all of these pawns first with something like queen c5, for example, just trying to attack the king and going for all of these pawns. If they defend it, then I'm just going to keep attacking them. I'm going to bring my king closer and closer and try and win all these pawns. And hopefully I'll win the rook as well. So if they hang the rook to a tactic, for example, so with a pin, a fork, a skewer, or a discovered attack, so something that I covered in the last semester, then essentially you can take all of these pieces and you win the game from there. And another example, if we're playing as black this time, we can see that they've got one rook and 3 pawns, whereas we've got 2 pawns, a queen, and a knight. So we're playing as black, and we're much better because again we have this queen. But notice how white's pawns over here, they're very close to promoting. So white needs to promote over here. So they're very close to promoting. So these 3 pawns right now should be the priority for black. We need to make sure that we stop these pawns by capturing them, pretty much. Like if we're able to capture all of these pawns and promote our own pawn, promote all of our own pawns into queens, hopefully we'll be able to take this rook as well, and we can deliver checkmate from there. Essentially, the queen is on cleanup duty, pretty much. It needs to make sure that it takes all of the opponent's pieces, and it becomes easier to deliver checkmate. And now it's your turn. Essentially, what we're going to do for the remaining 25 minutes of the session is that you guys are going to essentially try and practice all of the checkmating techniques that we learned today. So king and rook, 2 rooks, queen and king, and like basically just pair up against each other and try it out. See if you like if there's any errors that come up, and I'll be around like to try and help you guys out pretty much. And then if that makes sense, like if you feel like you're confident with it, then I've got some exercises later on the next slide. So this one of completely winning endgames, and essentially I want you guys to hopefully try and play them out pretty much. So one of you will play as black, one of you will play as white, and then once you deliver checkmate, so once the game is over, then swap colors with your opponent and let them play and try and checkmate you pretty much. And if you guys have any questions, then do let me know. But that's all the content for today. Like I'll be around to answer any of your questions. But for now, I just wanted to say thank you guys for coming, and that our next lesson is next week as well. So we're going to carry on more with endgames. But yeah, thank you guys for coming, and hopefully you guys can, I mean, we have boards, so hopefully you guys can like try it out and see if you know how to do it pretty much. But thank you guys.